Li Qi, on hearing Dong Tinglan play the tune The Sound of the Tartar Reed Flute, sent to Supervising Secretary Fang. Long ago, Tsai Yan wrote her Song of the Tartar Reed Flute. In all, it made up 18 stanzas. Hearing it, Tartars cried till their tears drenched the frontier grass, and the Han emissaries' hearts broke as they waited to take her home. Imagining the old ramparts deserted and signal fires cold, the white snow flying in that endless wasteland. Now he plucks the Shang note, then Jiao and Yu, and all around us autumn leaves rustle in reply. Oh, Master Dong, how great your genius! From deep in the mountains, spirits come to listen in the shadows. Slow notes, then fast, as the strings answer your hand. The music, as it ebbs and flows, seems to be pure emotion. On empty mountains, 100 birds scatter, then roost. The 1,000 miles of floating clouds, now dark, now bright. The mournful cry of a young goose flying in the night sky, or the sobbing of a mother cut off from her sons, far off among the Tartars. The river's waves are stilled, and birds stop their chatter. From a barbarian village, thoughts of home far away. In the sand and dust of Lhasa, a sad fate lamented. Then the sombre key changes, and a breeze, fresh with rain, blows through the forest, drops rattling on roof tiles. Spray from a spring flies into treetops, and a wild deer barks, trotting past the hall. East of the Chang'an Palace, by the Chancellery Wall, your offices face the Phoenix Pool and the blue lacquer gates. Though a great talent, you care nothing for fame or high office. Day and night, watching only for him to come, carrying his lute. Okay, so this is yet another poem by Li Qi, and yet another poem whose main topic is music, the power of music, the effect of music on people, and a description of the talents of the talented musician. In a way, it's very similar to the previous Song of a Lute. It's a bit bigger than that one, and it has other distinctive elements that we're going to comment in a minute. Now, one of the first things that strike us is the title. So the title mentions Dong Tinglan. Now, Dong Tinglan was a famous musician, a famous player of the thither, of the chin, in the first half of the 8th century. And he was specially reputed for his ability in playing one piece, the Hu Jia Shiva Pai, I think, or the Da Hu Jia, which is the tune that he is playing, or that he is referred to playing in this poem, the sound of the Tartar reed flute. So in the previous poem, if you remember, we also had a fine musician invited to play, but here this gets more specified. We know exactly who the musician is. There's also a reference to another person to whom this poem is sent, the supervising secretary Fang, of whom I have no information, and I'm not sure he makes an appearance in the poem, probably not. So what can we say about the tune, the sound of the Tartar reed flute? I'm not an expert on this, but I imagine the tune has been lost, as most musical tunes from a remote past have been lost. In fact, most of Tang music has been preserved, especially dances, in Japanese gagaku and bugaku. And the tradition has continued in China, but with later additions, accretions, modifications. Now, the sound of the Tartar reed flute was not born as a piece of music. It was actually born, as this poem explains at the beginning, as a poem. There is a poem called The Sound of the Tartar Reed Flute in 18 stanzas, a very popular and pathetic poem in the style of the ballads of the period of disunion. It's a joyful poem, of which we'll talk about in a minute. And that poem was later set to music, and probably at about the time that Dong Tinglan becomes an expert in playing it. So not very far in the past. And it's a very poignant story. As I said, we'll talk about it in a minute, about a Chinese woman trapped among the barbarians during many years. Important aspects of the poem, the seductive aspect of music. So in the Western literary tradition, there is a type of writing called an ekphrasis, which is, we see them notoriously in, for example, even in the Iliad, in the description of the shield of Achilles. So an ekphrasis is a description of a work of art. In the middle of the poem or text, a piece of painting or architecture or sculpture appears, and it is described. And there we get a fresco of different scenes that probably could not realistically or completely fit inside the space in which they're supposed to belong. But you get this inter-artistic relationship between a work of art and the literary description of the work of art. Here we get something similar to an ekphrasis, as we get a description of the effects and of the imaginings and of the emotions that a piece of music being played creates in its public. But it's a double-winded ekphrasis, because remember what we've just said. The piece of music refers back to a poem, which all the intellectuals would have known in Tang China. So it's a poem that everybody knows, translated into music, which inspires images, which at the next step inspire yet another poem about the music. Okay then, let's go piece by piece as usual. I'm not sure this poem is divided into even-shaped couplets. In the translation, for example, the lines have very different lengths. And, this probably should have been allowed, but remember, we're in a section of heptasyllabic gushi, which means that what probably has happened is that the translator has cut the long lines wherever he has seen fit. So it will be difficult to just analyze the couplets, but I'll try. So we start. Long ago, Tsai Yan wrote her song of the Tartar reed flute. In all, it made up 18 stanzas. So Tsai, we mentioned before that poem, the Song of the Tartar Reed Flute. Now, this poem is put into the voice of a woman from the late Han Dynasty, the time of its downfall, Tsai Yan, who was the daughter of a great intellectual of the late Han, Tsai Yung. Now, this woman, we know that from the historical chronicles, was in fact abducted by barbarians at the fall of the Han Dynasty and spent more than a decade living in Central Asia. Afterwards, she was ransomed by the Prime Minister of China, and she went back to her home again, but had to leave the children that had been born in captivity from a marriage to a barbarian, and she returned to a rather desolate land where her relatives were all dead. Now, this story has had an enormous pathos for the Chinese during the ages. It was the topic of many operas and plays later on, of many poems in all historical periods. And there are 3 poems that were attributed to her. We believe those attributions are probably false. And the third one is precisely the one we're talking about, the Song of the Tartar Reed Flute, which is the longest. From stylistic aspects, it probably was composed very soon before the Tang Dynasty came into being, so probably in the 6th, 7th century. Late 6th century, probably. So, what we need to know about this? Well, it's just a poem about this woman, Tsai Yan, crying on her way to exile, being mistreated as a prisoner, living and describing a horrible exotic landscape, which is not the Chinese landscape, with cruel winds and harsh deserts and colds. Suffering again when she is called back to return to China because she has to leave her children, and describing those scenes. And crying again when she reaches China again to see a desolate home without relatives, without a husband, without family, without anything. So the original poem that I read is a pretty traditional Jue Fu ballad. It's very narrative, with this intensification of the sufferings of the woman, but pretty narrative and pretty easy to read. Back to Lichi's poem. Its first lines introduce us. They reference us, this poem of presumably of long ago, Tsai Jan's Song of the Tartar Reed Flute. Next couplet, what was the effect that this original song was supposed to have caused on its receptors, on the people who heard the song being recited, well, not the song, the poem? Hearing it, Tartars cried till their tears drenched the frontier grass, and the Han emissaries' hearts broke as they waited to take her home. So the emotional, the moving aspect of music and of poetry is emphasized here. The images are rather conventional. There's hearts breaking, people crying without end. We've encountered these images in previous poems, and they're a bit topical. But the emphasis is on how through different races and peoples, both are affected by the plight and the sad song of this woman, whether it be the barbarians she lived with and whom she is now abandoning, including her children, whether it be the Chinese, they both feel moved by the sad story of this defenseless prisoner woman. And both cry for different reasons. Imagining the old ramparts deserted and signal fires cold, the white snow flying in that endless wasteland. So, the Han emissaries' hearts, or is it the Tartars, who are imagining the old ramparts deserted and the signal fires cold? I'm not sure. This is a bit ambiguous for me, but anyway, whether it be Tsai Jan herself or her Chinese companions, they seem to be reminiscing with sadness the old frontier from the late Han time, which has been destroyed since the barbarians came and invaded, and the Chinese had to take refuge in closer lands to the heartland. There's an image, therefore, of abandoned fortresses, of the signal fires for warning in the frontier of many barbarians. Cold, nobody is tending all those signal fires. Snow everywhere, the cold snow of the winter and of the steppe. Probably this image is taken from the original Song of the Tartar Reed Flute, although I can't remember precisely. So what happens now? We have a move. We were right now describing the poem, The Sound of the Tartar Reed Flute, its original creator, its effect on the public who heard it. Now we move on to the musician who is playing a version of this song. And, it's juxtaposed quite directly without any sort of transition or introduction. Now he plucks the Shang note, then Jiao and Yu. And all around us autumn leaves rustle in reply. So the musician starts playing. The names Shang, Jiao, Yu are notes of the Chinese pentatonic scale, I believe. Shang is the note that is usually connected with autumn, with the west, with iron, with cold. And the numinous, the almost magical power of music and of this musician's musical skills is emphasized by its correlation with nature. That is to say, the musician plays the Shang note, and around us, the autumn leaves, also an autumn sound, echo in reply. There is a correlation between the microcosm and the macrocosm, between the music created by the artist and the music created by the autumn leaves and the season. They are in harmony. Oh, Master Dong, how great your genius! So now begins the ekphrastic section that I was rambling about in the beginning. The musician has been introduced, he's starting to play, he's a great genius, and now we're going to get a series of images that are those that appear in the mind and in the heart of the listeners to Master Dong's melody. From deep in the mountains, spirits come to listen in the shadows. Slow notes, then fast, as the strings answer your hand. The concert begins. There is an almost Orphic tone in which, if not the animals, the spirits of the mountains come to listen to the musician. And he's a good musician. He's able to work on the chin very proficiently and very quickly moving from short to long, from slow to fast notes up and down the strings. The music, as it ebbs and flows, seems to be pure emotion. On empty mountains, 100 birds scatter, then roost. So the music starts playing, it ebbs and flows, and music is equated with emotion. So the Chinese thought that this was an essential truth from the very beginning of their cultural literary history. Poetry expresses intention, poetry expresses what's in the heart, and music expresses what's in the heart. Music is also an expression of emotions, a harmonizing of the emotions of the individual with the cosmos. And this is what happens. The music starts playing. The music is pure emotion. From being a pure art form, it passes to be a pure transmission of feelings and also a crafter of images. The first one that appears, empty mountains, birds scattering and then roosting. The music is creating this effect. Probably the notes, the glissandos, create this impression in the listener of a sudden emptiness and a sudden movement filling the emptiness. And we continue with more images that are supposed to be aroused by the music. 1,000 miles of floating clouds, now dark, now bright. The mournful cry of a young goose flying lost in the night sky, or the sobbing of a mother cut off from her sons, far off among the Tartars. Different images that are juxtaposed. Are they related? First of all, we have clouds. They seem to remember the previous image of the birds scattering and nesting. Now, 1,000 miles of floating clouds, some dark, some bright. Again, maybe correlated with the fast and slow notes or the high and low tones. We get one tone, the mournful cry of a young goose flying lost in the night sky. It's a typical image in Chinese poetry of autumn, of separation. And it's leading us back to the original poem. Or the sobbing of a mother, cut off from her sons, far off among the Tartars. So here we seem to be getting back to the story of Tsai Wenji. The effects of the music have been likened to a series of things. First, birds scattering and getting together. Then, in the empty mountains. Then, clouds, an enormous amount of clouds, changing color, some light, some dark. Then a goose flying alone. So this probably could be a melody or a sub-melody introduced into the piece. The lonely goose flying away, and that lonely goose flying away, at least the sounds it makes, merge. Its cry merges with the cry of a mother away from her sons and away from her home, like Tsai Wenji. Well, Tsai Wenji was, Tsai Wenji was away from her home, but close to her children. And now, when the poem evolves, when the poem is ending, she experiences the reversal. She is going back to China, but without her children. The river's waves are stilled. Birds stop their chatter. Silence. Until now we had a lot of movement, a lot of sound. It seems to be stilling now, to be reaching a conclusion, and the two images are frozen waves and silent birds. From a barbarian village, thoughts of home far away, and the sand and dust of Lhasa, a sad fate lamented. So finally we get this last image of a barbarian village, thoughts of going back home, desert landscape. I don't know why Lhasa appears here. If this is the Lhasa in Tibet, it would have been very far away from the Tartar, not very, but far away from the Tartar lands. I'm not sure why it appears here. I'll have to check this afterwards. But well, anyway, we get this final image of loneliness in a desert landscape in a lonely hut, far away from home. Okay, then we get a move, different tone. Probably the dark passages, the melancholy passages of the music give way to a lighter, happier, at least more spring-like tone. Then the somber key changes and a breeze, fresh with rain, blows through the forest, drops rattling on roof tiles. So now the key changes from the very dark, brooding tone and story and music of exile and sadness. We get a lighter tone, like a fresh rain that has just come and fallen over the forest and is dripping over the roof. Spray from a spring flies into treetops, and a wild deer barks, trotting past the hall. So more subdued, more friendly images of nature. Yeah? Watery images, rain falling, a fountain or a spring gushing, a deer making a light sound next to the pavilion. We're still, the images that are being created in the mind of the listeners are still images of nature, but now not of far away, distant, sad, exotic lands, but of the closer forested areas and of rain. Finally, the poem in the last two couplets seems to again move away. Remember, we started the poem with the world of Tsai Wenji, Tsai Jan's poem and captivity. Then we jumped into the world of the musician Master Dong, and of him playing, and of the effect and of the images that his music creates on the listeners. And finally, in the conclusion, we seem to get out of the poetry, and the music, perhaps the playing has ceased, and we get a location, or we return to the location in which presumably Li Qi, Master Dong, and perhaps the supervising secretary Fang of the title are in, the place where they're working and also where they listen to the music of Master Dong. East of the Chang'an Palace, by the Chancellery Wall, your office faces the Phoenix Pole and the blue lacquer gates. Though great talent, you care nothing for fame or high office. Day and night, watching only for him to come, carrying his lute. So the question is, who is being referred to in these last lines? As I said before in other poems, Chinese poetry is very ambiguous about the subjects and the characters in poems. So this creates a certain ambiguity, which is difficult to clarify. So we get very clearly moved to the Chancellery. Chancellery was one of the great departments of state in Imperial China, and it was, as is explained here, next to the Imperial Palace in Chang'an. And who is there? Because we get a description of somebody whose office faces the Phoenix Pool and the blue lacquer gates. Now, in all probability, I'm imagining the person who is occupying those offices is either the musician Dong Tinglan or the person to whom this poem is being sent, Secretary Fang. If I had to bet, I would say it's the second one, which explains his presence in the title. So now we get to that third person, and he is flattered by the last couplet of Li Qi's poem. Though a great talent, you care nothing for fame or high office. You have a great talent, you're serving in office, but that's not what worries you. What fascinates or worries you? Listening to the music of Master Dong, like me. Day and night, watching only for him to come, carrying his lute. Okay, so a long poem and a bit dark of poem, a bit difficult to understand. Lots of images of music. Again, the next poem that we will be talking about tomorrow is also a poem about music and about musical instruments. So, okay, quite ambiguous, quite interesting, I imagine. This has been long enough. No, this is the longest video yet, I think. So we'll continue tomorrow.